Hello, my name is Ava Steinberger.
And I'm Savannah Comperi. We are both freshmen here at Bates. Welcome to our podcast.
Today we'll be discussing the image Azle, Texas, War Decor Photographs in America. This photograph was taken by Nan Coulter in 1991. In the first part of our podcast, we will analyze the details of the image, such as the yellow ribbons on the doors, the boarded up windows, and the contrast between dark and light.
Then that'll lead us into discussing the relationship between the ribbons and what they were doing for the public conversation regarding the Gulf War. Then we will dive into the complexities of choices with the media and how war images of the Vietnam War affected public opinion. Then finally, we will round out our discussion talking on the versatility of war images and how they effectively represent different aspects of war.
Sounds like a plan. Let's get into it.
So Ava, when you initially look at the Nan Coulter image, what do you see?
Well, it shows a section of a worn down building. There are clear signs of damage to the building, which I'm guessing are due to age. I personally was first drawn to the two doors with the bright new yellow bows. The doors have two little diamond-shaped windows, and the bows are attached to the bottom of each window. On the doors, there's also an old bronze doorknob, however, the deadlock above it appears new. In front of one of the doors, there's a small, dirty mat. Next to the right door, there's a piece of paper tacked to the building.
Yeah, I noticed that. It's hard to tell what it says. It's too far away from the camera. I'm curious and unsure if it's significant to the photo, but that's a very thought-provoking detail. What I first noticed is that above the doors, there are 3 wood panels that appear to be covering up damage to the part of the building. The wood panels are shaped symmetrically above the 2 doors. Symmetry is a big pattern within this image.
Oh yeah, for sure. The vantage point of the photograph, positioned right at the center of the building, is strategic. This perspective, where we viewers stand looking at the photograph from the same position that the photographer did, emphasizes the doors with the 2 bright yellow bows. Even though the building looks worn down and empty, the bows and deadlock are new. This juxtaposition adds to the utter fascination about what this building is and who owns it. Perhaps someone else put the bows on the doors, or the owner put the deadlock on to ensure that others stay out of the building.
I completely agree. Also, the fact that there is no one outside of it, no windows are able to be looked into, and the wood panels are covering up something makes this image eerily empty. It makes me wonder if the lack of people was an artistic choice made by Coulter to emphasize the apparent eeriness of the building. Regarding the lack of windows, that was a choice made by whoever owns the building itself. Maybe the purpose of the building was to hide contents within the building from the outside world. However, the reason for the lack of windows remains unclear.
Coulter's use of light is doing a lot for the image, specifically the contrast between light and dark. The warm yellow tint reflecting off of the building is light and cheery. While the sky is bright outside of the building, the inside of the building looks pitch black. This contrast somewhat represents the U.S. population's conflicting feelings regarding the war. There was an internal struggle felt by many between their want to show their support for the troops overseas, which would represent the bright, cheerful light, and their dislike of the war in general, which would represent the dark features of the building. Going back to the building's appearance, given the wood paneling that is covering what seems to have been a window, one can assume that whoever is inside of the building, or owns it, chose to keep it dark. It makes you wonder why said person does not want to let any light in. Are they trying to hide something, or is the building abandoned?
That's a compelling take. I noticed that the boarded up windows are not the only feature of the building that suggests that it has been potentially abandoned. It is extremely dirty and has not been maintained with care. The painting on the outside has been chipped, and the lowsome mat outside of one of the doors is crooked and appears to have been randomly placed. I think there is a lot to be said about the manipulation of something in order to hide or to expose. You can see how artistic choices like this can affect the viewer's perception of whatever message is trying to be conveyed through an image. We should probably provide a little bit of background information about the Gulf War for listeners who might not know a lot about it.
Good idea. Do you want to take this one?
Sure. So basically, it was a conflict between Iraq and the United States-led Union with 42 countries. It began with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. The United Nations first set an embargo and sanctions on Iraq, but the ground war did not start until January 16, 1991. The war ended on February 28, 1991, with the defeat of Iraq, which subsequently retreated from Kuwait. To place our photograph within the time frame of the war, it was taken in Texas 1991, which coincides with the U.S. military's involvement in it.
The ribbons in our photograph represented a lot more than a typical symbol of solidarity, and contained many different layers. They were meant to show support for the troops overseas, as well as contribute to the much larger conversation of American civilians' ambivalence towards the war in general.
That's really interesting. Why is there so much ambivalence around the Gulf War?
Well, America as a whole was still recovering from the deep traumas of the Vietnam War, which ended in 1975. Many people were unhappy with the image of jumping into a new war, especially since the reasons for joining the war were somewhat questionable, specifically regarding President Bush's governmental policies in the years leading up to the war. Namely, people were unhappy with the Bush administration's last-minute, meaning after the decision to go to war had already been made, considerations of the possible outcomes of the Gulf crisis. Bush also seemed to view oil as a large factor for joining the war, but many Americans did not view oil as important enough. Lastly, the potential Iraqi threat of nuclear weaponry was a widely shared concept among the American people as a reason to go to war. However, the Bush administration did not adopt this thinking until much later. Once they did, they deemed it as a close threat, and as a result, did not give economic sanctions enough time to work as a possible alternative to war, which was disappointing to many. When reading In the Wake of the Gulf War by George Mariscal, I found one quote from a demonstrator in Boston who summed up these mixed feelings surrounding the war by stating, "The yellow ribbons represent the fact that I support the troops but not the president's policy, and not the policies of the last 10 years that got us there."
Huh. Thinking about the duality of the ribbons, they represented both support for the troops / the loyalty to the country and representation of the larger conversation opposing the war.
Exactly. These ribbons represented so much in terms of keeping the conversation present and in visible form. The beauty of them is that they didn't have to mean the same thing to everyone.
What do you mean by that?
Well, while there was an overlaying message associated with them, not everyone who displayed them felt that same sense of ambivalence. Given how pervasive the ribbons were, it was impossible for the ribbon to signify the same thing to each person displaying them. As one article written by Aaron David Gresson puts it, the ribbon was everywhere, on trees, fences, car antennas, light poles, and the doors of houses, barns, and churches. Then followed with, the ambiguity of the yellow ribbon allowed for personalized narratives. This quote perfectly encapsulates the universal nature of the yellow ribbon. It seems like it was put in more places than the American flag, which is insane to even conceptualize. However, the second quote about how the ribbon allowed for personalized narratives helps to explain why the ribbons were so popular. Take our image, for example. Whoever owns that building, which is completely nondescript, clearly does not like to express themselves or their thoughts. The windows are blocked off, there aren't any other flags in the building, etc. But what's the only distinctive object on it? The ribbons. However, we still do not know what they mean to the owner. Therefore, the building exemplifies how popular these ribbons were, yet how they simultaneously managed to not spread a direct message.
Okay, so it sounds like people were able to change the message that the ribbons sent so that they pertained to their distinctive feelings about the war.
Yeah, exactly. For example, some people would pair the ribbons with the American flag as an expression of patriotism. For others, they would put up or even wear the ribbon as a sign of remembrance for either someone they knew that was deployed or a loved one who was killed. Clearly, this multifaceted ribbon represented a huge shift from the traditional mutual sign of solidarity and patriotism represented by the American flag. What better way to portray the many different feelings about the war than through a symbol that provokes conversation that is just as equivocal, am I right?
For sure. I think you summed up how the ribbons contributed so much to the participation of American civilians with their expression of the war and how these ribbons encapsulated how different people's perceptions were. I think we can connect this to the broader idea of media distribution of images of war. More specifically, the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War, and how the lack of neutrality of the press affected the conversations and people's perception of it all.
I'd love to hear more.
The documentation of the Vietnam War, particularly the My Lai massacre, revealed significant instances of lack of neutrality in the news coverage, shedding light on how such practices influenced the American public's perception of the war. For those not familiar with the My Lai massacre, this tragedy occurred on March 16, 1968. The soldiers of Charlie Company were sent to My Lai with a search and destroy mission under the impression that Viet Cong enemies were there. In reality, the men of Charlie Company ended up killing over 500 unarmed civilians, most of them being women and children. This tragedy was photographed by Ron Haberle, but his images weren't consistently publicized because of their graphic nature.
You say that there was a lack of neutrality with the news coverage, but from what I've heard, the Vietnam War was known for its abundance of documentation and publicity surrounding the war. What do you mean by this, and how did it influence the public's perception?
Great question. So what I mean is that the idea that the Vietnam War being considered uncensored with its publications of images has persisted as a widely accepted belief. However, according to Michael Griffin, author of Media of War and Conflict, he argues that there were inconsistencies in war images like the ones documenting the My Lai massacre that were not consistently publicized. Media coverage of images depicting the My Lai massacre didn't experience neutral appearances in the news because of their content.
I think it's intriguing that you speak on the publicization of the Vietnam War, but how do you think this connects to our overall conversation of media distribution of images of war and its effects on people's perceptions and conversations?
Well, there have been scholarly and investigative analysis of media coverage during the Vietnam War that challenge this narrative. For instance, according to Dr. Griffin, Ron Haberle's photographs depicting the My Lai massacre were not publicly released until more than 20 months after the killings in March of 1968. Selected images made their initial appearance in the Cleveland Dealer on November 20th, 1969, but even after their publication, Haberle's photos received limited exposure, as Life magazine hesitated for months before deciding to purchase the pictures, and several other publications refrained from printing such graphic war images. However, Seymour Hersh's written account of the massacre, which had no photographs, was distributed by the Dispatch News Service on November 13, 1969, a week before Haberle's photos appeared in the Plain Dealer. Interestingly, Hersh's written account seems to have a more significant impact on the public awareness of the incident than Haberle's photographs. What I'm trying to say is that I think there's something to be said about not just how images of war affected public perception, but also how the choices that are being made when sharing information to the public can make an impact of how and when people will react to them.
But is this about a lack of neutrality due to the photograph's graphic contents, or is it more about the context behind the photo? The My Lai massacre was a horrific tragedy that reflects poorly on the American military's morality. Referring back to what you said earlier, the images of it weren't published until more than 20 months after it occurred. I'm now wondering if this was because of how explicit the images were, or because the releasing of them would ultimately leave a stain on the public perception of the U.S. military. Clearly, the photographs of the Vietnam War sparked the American population's attention and encouraged them to protest to end the war.
That is a different way of looking at it. Can you further explain your reasoning for how images influenced public opinion of the Vietnam War?
Yeah, sure. For example, Napalm Girl is an image that was photographed by Nick Ut on June 8, 1972. It depicts a group of children with horrified faces running towards the camera. The focal point of the image seems to be a child who is completely naked. Her arms are spread away from her body while she runs, and her facial expression suggests that she is screaming in pain. This image was taken after Vietnamese troops accidentally dropped napalm, a jellied gas weaponized for war, on Vietnamese civilians and other troops. The girl in question had been doused in napalm and was trying to escape the burning sensation by tearing her clothes off, which explains why she was screaming in pain and naked. This image was one of many that horrified Americans and changed their perception of the war.
Now that you mention that actually reminds me of an aspect of an essay called Regarding the Pain of Others, written by Susan Sontag in 2003. She was a writer who wrote a plethora of different topics, but this essay in particular discusses the atrocity surrounding war. A particular part of her essay speaks on how she argues that, quote, public attention is steered by the attentions of the media, which means, most decisively, images. When there are photographs, a war becomes real, end quote. This statement encapsulates the profound impact of viewing war images, emphasizing how the visual exposure, as opposed to a merely textual description, brings the brutal realities of war to those not directly immersed in it. The significance of war images can vary widely, as they hold the power to evoke diverse emotions and perspectives in individuals.
Yeah, exactly. There are so many images associated with war, but not all of them represent the same aspect of it. Pictures don't necessarily need to be graphic to be war-related, like the burst of joy photo, for example.
Oh yeah, that photo you were referring to was photographed by Slava Vader, and it photographs Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Sturm being greeted by his family at an Air Force base in Fairfield, California on March 17, 1973. This was his homecoming after being a POW for over 5 years. This photo captures Lieutenant Colonel Sturm facing away from the camera as his family runs to greet him, smiling wide. His eldest daughter is seen running with open arms, about to greet him with a hug. This photo was largely publicized and praised for its all-American aesthetic. The family is experiencing a wholesome moment of relief and joy while they greet their loved one whose life had been deeply altered by the war.
So are you saying that war images are extremely versatile, in that they can send different messages and be interpreted in different ways?
That is what I'm trying to say. The burst of joy photograph depicting Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Sturm's homecoming exemplifies the power of visual symbols during the Vietnam War. It conveyed a sense of joy, relief, and a return to normalcy after a harrowing experience of being a prisoner of war, while the Napalm Girl photograph is depicting the horrors and realities of war. These images are both representations of war, yet they convey distinct meanings, and it's not necessary for them to evoke identical emotional responses to share a common theme.
That contrast reminds me of our earlier discussion about the multifaceted ribbons and how they were used to express various sentiments regarding the war.
Absolutely. The ribbons became a complex symbol representing the different emotions and perspectives on the Gulf War, which is similar to how these photos serve as war representation, but that representation can have many various meanings, depending on what the photographer is trying to capture.
It's intriguing how the narrative of war was influenced not only by documentation, but also by the way certain images were chosen and presented to the public. Well, Savannah, I think we covered a lot today.
We definitely did. What aspect did you like the most?
I really enjoyed our conversation on the symbolism of the yellow ribbons during the Gulf War, and how they can be used to represent so many different opinions while still holding a common theme, and how there was so much ambivalence surrounding the war. What did you enjoy the most?
I liked our discussion on the Vietnam War and how there were so many war images, but not all of them have to be graphic to be war-related. Just like our Nan Coulter image regarding the Gulf War. It represents the conversation of war, but it isn't what people would generally associate an image of war to look like. There is so much that can be unpacked when examining images of war.
Absolutely. We could spend hours talking about this, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed it.